The air in the New York subway was a mixture of frost and forgotten dreams. Marcus Hale, a man whose hands once mended hearts, now coaxed a haunting melody from a scarred violin. Thousands ignored him, a ghost in the machinery of the city. But tonight, a silhouette stumbled. A man collapsed, gasping for breath, the very man who had stolen Marcus's life. The music stopped. The surgeon was reborn in the dark, between the screeching of steel and the indifference of the crowd. A silent choice was made. Choice that would rewrite the destiny of two bitter rivals in the shadows of the underground. The subterranean arteries of Manhattan breathed a heavy, metallic sigh. It was a rhythmic, almost predatory sound. The collective exhales of 1,000 travelers, the screech of steel wheels against iron rails, and the distant, low-frequency hum of a city that never learned how to sleep. Down here, in the bowels of the 42nd Street station, the air was different. It was thicker, laden with the scent of ozone, damp concrete, and the lingering residue of a million hurried lives. The lights overhead flickered with a clinical, nauseating frequency, casting long, jittery shadows that danced across the grime-streaked tiles. For most, this place was merely a transit point, a necessary purgatory between the office and the home. But for Marcus Hale, this was his auditorium. This was the only place left in the world where he could still feel the vibrations of existence without being crushed by them. Marcus stood against a soot-stained pillar, his tall, lean frame draped in a coat that had seen better decades. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, the wool thinned by years of exposure to the biting New York winters and the stagnant heat of the tunnels. Once, he had worn the finest Italian silk and tailored scrubs that smelled of antiseptic and excellence. Now, he smelled of wood resin and wood smoke. In his hands, he held a violin, not a Stradivarius, but a humble, scarred instrument that seemed to be held together by nothing more than memory and glue. He tucked it under his chin, the wood cool against his skin, and began to play. The music was not the cheerful, frenetic tempo of a street performer seeking coins. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful lament, a piece of his own soul being dragged across the strings. The notes rose and fell like a tide of grief, weaving through the cacophony of the evening rush. He watched the faces of the commuters, the blurred masks of exhaustion and apathy. To them, he was invisible. He was a piece of the architecture, a living statue of poverty that they had trained their eyes to skip over. They didn't see the way his fingers, though calloused and weathered, moved with the surgical precision of a master. They didn't see the way his eyes, a piercing, intellectual gray, scanned the crowd with a diagnostic clarity that even years of hardship could not dull. Marcus closed his eyes, and for a moment, the subway vanished. The smell of the tunnel was replaced by the sharp, sterile tang of a world-class operating theater. He could almost feel the weight of the scalpel in his hand, that delicate, holy instrument of preservation. He remembered the silence of the OR, the rhythmic, reassuring beep of the heart monitor, and the absolute focus that had once defined his life. He had been Dr. Marcus Hale, the architect of the heart, a man whose surgical hands were insured for millions and whose reputation was untarnished. He had saved heads of state, paupers, and everyone in between. He had believed in the sanctity of the pulse, in the nobility of the craft, but that life had been incinerated. The memory of the betrayal flickered in his mind like a film strip caught in a projector. The headlines, the false accusations of medical malpractice, the carefully orchestrated leaks that painted him as a reckless, substance-abusing surgeon. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculated assassination of his character, led by Julian Vance, the hospital's CEO, a man who saw patients as spreadsheets and doctors as liabilities. Julian had needed a scapegoat for a botched clinical trial that threatened the hospital's stock price, and Marcus, with his uncompromising ethics and refusal to sign off on flawed data, had been the perfect target. Within months, Marcus's medical license was revoked, his assets frozen by endless litigation, and his name dragged through the mud until even his closest colleagues turned away in shame. He opened his eyes as a train roared past, the gust of wind tugging at his hair. He was back in the grime. He was back in the silence of his own making. He shifted his stance, his boots clicking softly on the tile, and transitioned into a minor key. The music grew more intense, more demanding. It was a protest against the cold, a scream muffled by the wood and wire. He felt the vibration in his jawbone, the physical manifestation of his resilience. He had lost his title, his home, and his dignity, but they could not take the music. They could not take the knowledge stored in his fingertips. Suddenly, the rhythm of the evening broke. The predictable flow of the crowd stuttered. Near the edge of the platform, a man in an expensive, charcoal gray overcoat began to sway. His movements were erratic, his hand clutching at his chest in a gesture Marcus recognized with a visceral jolt of instinct. The man's face, pale and glistening with a cold sweat even in the freezing air, turned toward the light. He gasped a wet, desperate sound that was lost to most of the crowd but rang like a bell in Marcus's ears. Marcus didn't stop playing immediately. He watched as the man's knees buckled. The expensive briefcase he carried hit the floor with a dull thud, spilling papers across the dirty tile. People began to swerve around him, some looking with curiosity, others with annoyance, assuming it was just another drunk or a vagrant. But Marcus knew. He saw the cyanosis, the faint blue tint creeping into the man's lips. He saw the way the man's eyes rolled back, searching for a breath that wouldn't come. As the man collapsed fully, hitting the ground with a sickeningly heavy sound, his face was finally illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light. Marcus's bow hand faltered. The music died a sudden, discordant death. The man on the floor, gasping for his final breaths in the filth of the 42nd Street station, was Julian Vance. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. The distant rumble of the next train felt like a countdown. Marcus looked down at the man who had orchestrated his ruin. Julian Vance, the architect of his misery, was now at the mercy of the very hands he had tried to destroy. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in Marcus's mouth. A single thought echoed through his mind. Let him go. If he stayed behind his pillar, if he simply tucked his violin away and walked into the darkness of the tunnel, justice would be served by the cold, indifferent hand of fate. No one would know. No one would care. Julian would die on a subway floor, surrounded by the common people he had spent his life looking down upon. But then, the surgeon Esotha one he had taken decades ago in a room filled with light, and hope began to pulse in his veins. It was stronger than the bitterness. It was deeper than the hunger in his stomach. Marcus looked at his hands, hands of a vagrant, the hands of a musician, and saw them for what they truly were. He dropped the violin. The instrument clattered against the stone, a sound of profound sacrifice. Marcus moved. He didn't run. He glided, his muscle memory taking over, his mind shifting from the abstract world of music to the concrete high-stakes reality of trauma. He pushed through the gathering circle of onlookers, his voice cutting through the air with an authority he hadn't used in 5 years. "Move," he commanded. "Clear the space. I need room." The crowd, startled by the sudden transformation of the invisible beggar into a man of command, parted. Marcus dropped to his knees beside Julian. The smell of expensive cologne mingled with the stench of the subway. Marcus reached out, his fingers pressing against Julian's carotid artery. The pulse was thready, erratic, a dying bird fluttering against a windowpane. Julian's eyes flickered open for a fraction of a second, unfocused and clouded by terror. He didn't recognize Marcus. He only saw a man in a tattered coat leaning over him. Marcus tore open Julian's silk tie, the fabric ripping under his grip. He began the compressions. 1, 2, 3. The rhythmic pressure, the calculated force, it was a symphony of a different kind. The sound of a human rib cracking under the pressure of a desperate palm is a noise that haunts the dreams of those who understand it. It is not the clean snap of a dry twig, it is a dull, sickening crunch that vibrates through the rescuer's arms and settles deep in the marrow of their own bones. Marcus felt Italiano. He felt the resistance of Julian's chest wall give way as he leaned his entire weight into the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm was a metronome of survival, a visceral heartbeat forced upon a body that had decided to quit. Sweat began to bead on Marcus's forehead, stinging his eyes and dripping onto the charcoal gray wool of Julian's expensive coat. The cold of the subway station was no longer an adversary. Marcus was burning from the inside out, fueled by an adrenaline he hadn't felt in half a decade. Around them, the world continued its indifferent orbit, yet a vacuum of silence seemed to have formed in this small patch of grime-covered tile. A circle of onlookers had gathered, their faces illuminated by the harsh, flickering glow of their smartphone screens. They were recording. They were documenting the spectacle of a tattered vagrant straddling a man of obvious wealth. Their movements, a grotesque dance of life and death. Someone was screaming for an ambulance, their voice high-pitched and vibrating with a panic that Marcus tuned out with surgical precision. He wasn't a homeless man anymore. He wasn't the violinist of the 42nd Street tunnel. He was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, and the world outside the diameter of Julian's chest had ceased to exist. "Stay with me, Julia," Marcus hissed through clenched teeth. It wasn't a plea of mercy, it was an order. He wouldn't let this man die, not like this, not before the truth had its day. He could see the veins in Julian's neck bulging, the skin turning a bruised, necrotic purple. The man's eyes were half open, glazed and vacant, staring up at the soot-covered ceiling of the station, as if searching for an exit. Marcus tilted Julian's head back, clearing the airway with a practiced flick of his wrist. He looked at the mouth that had once uttered the lies that dismantled his career. Without hesitation, he leaned down and breathed life into it. The air he gave was cold and tasted of the tunnels, but it was filled with the oxygen of a second chance. As Marcus pulled back to resume the compressions, he felt a sudden, sharp jerk on his shoulder. A transit officer, his face a mask of suspicion and aggression, tried to pull him away. "Hey, get off him. Get back," the officer shouted, his hand hovering over his holster. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He locked his elbows, his hands never losing their rhythm. "He's in V." Marcus rolled red, his voice booming with a command that stopped the officer in his tracks. "I have a suspected myocardial infarction with a secondary respiratory arrest. If I stop, he's dead in 45 seconds. Call dispatch, tell them we need a defibrillator and an ACLS kit. Immediately. Do your job, and let me do mine." The officer blinked, stunned by the lexicon of a medical professional coming from a man who smelled of the streets. The authority in Marcus' tone was undeniably it was the voice of a man who was used to being the smartest person in the room. The officer stepped back, fumbling for his radio, his bravado replaced by a bewildered compliance. The crowd whispered, the tension thickening like a fog. Who was this man? Why did his hands move with such terrifying efficiency? Minutes stretched into an eternity. Marcus's muscles began to scream in protest. The lactic acid built up in his shoulders, a burning reminder of his own physical frailty after years of malnutrition and sleeping on concrete. But he refused to yield. Every time his heart wavered, he looked at Julian's face. He saw the man who had sat across a mahogany desk and told him that his services were no longer required. He saw the man who had stood at a press conference and watched as Marcus's reputation was fed to the wolves. The anger was there, a dark, roiling ocean of it, but Marcus used it as fuel. He would save Julian Vance not because he loved him, but because he was a doctor, and a doctor does not choose who deserves to live. Finally, the distant wail of a siren pierced the subterranean gloom. It grew ludere more frantic, until the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the station's entrance stairs. A team of paramedics burst onto the platform, their heavy gear clattering. They pushed through the crowd, their expressions hard and focused. When they saw Marcus, they initially moved to shove him aside, but one of the medics of Vetra, with graying temples, caught sight of Marcus's technique. He saw the way Marcus was monitoring the carotid pulse with his thumb while maintaining the compressions. He saw the way Marcus had positioned the body to maximize blood flow to the brain. "I've got 10 minutes of high-quality CPR in," Marcus said, his voice ragged but steady. "I suspect a massive blockage in the left anterior descendant artery. He needs a bolus of epinephrine and immediate intubation. Get the pads on him now." The paramedic didn't argue. He signaled his partner to prep the defibrillator. As they took over, Marcus slowly stood up. His knees popped, and his legs felt like lead. He stepped back into the shadows, his hands trembling not from fear but from the sudden release of tension. He watched as they applied the shocks. Julian's body lurched, a puppet on a wire. Once, twice. On the third attempt, the monitor let out a jagged, beautiful beep. A pulse. It was weak, but it was there. As the paramedics loaded Julian onto the gurney, the station became a whirlwind of motion. Police were questioning witnesses, and the crowd was dispersing, their hunger for drama momentarily sated. Marcus reached down and picked up his violin. The wood was cold. A small crack had formed along the side from where he had dropped a permanent scar from this night. He tucked the instrument under his arm and began to walk away, his silhouette blending into the dark mouth of the tunnel. 3 hours later, at the St. Jude Medical Center, the very hospital where Julian Vance still reigned as CEO, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. Julian was in the intensive care unit, stabilized but still unconscious. His wife, Maya, a woman of porcelain beauty and sharp intellect, sat in the waiting room, her hands trembling. Beside her stood the hospital's board of directors, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and political anxiety. The lead paramedic walked into the room, still wiping the grime of the subway from his forehead. He looked at Maya and the board members. "He's alive," the medic said, his voice filled with a lingering disbelief. "But you shouldn't be thanking us. By the time we got there, he should have been brain dead. Some gas street performer, I think, kept him going. He knew things he shouldn't have known. He saved your husband's life with nothing but his bare hands and a voice that sounded like it came from a god." Maya looked up, her eyes wide. "Who was he? Did you get a name?" The paramedic shook his head. "No. He just disappeared into the tunnels. But I'll tell you one thing, way better he is. He wasn't just a busker. He handled that scene like a surgeon. In the ICU, Julian Vance's eyes flickered beneath his lids. He was trapped in the twilight between worlds. In his mind, he saw the face of the man who had leaned over him in the dark. He saw the gray eyes piercing, intellectual, and filled with a mercy he didn't understand. He remembered those eyes. He remembered the way they had looked at him across a courtroom 5 years ago. A cold dread began to seep into Julian's recovering heart, a realization that was more terrifying than death itself. The man he had destroyed was the only reason he was still breathing. The morning light crawled across the sterile white walls of the ICU like a slow, inquisitive spider. It was a cold, unforgiving brightness, the kind of light that reveals every hairline fracture in a person's soul. Julian Vance lay submerged in a sea of high thread count sheets and the rhythmic, synthetic breathing of a ventilator. The air here was filtered, scrubbed of all humanity, smelling of ozone and the faint, sweet scent of floor wax. As the sedative haze began to lift, Julian's world slowly assembled itself from the fragments of his memory. He felt the heavy, aching soreness in his chest, a phantom weight, where Marcus's hands had pressed against his sternum. He remembered the darkness of the tunnel, the smell of the damp earth, and the terrifying realization that his heart was stopping. And then, he remembered the music. He remembered a face leaning over him, a face etched with lines of hardship but illuminated by an intelligence that was unmistakable. It was a face from his nightmares. Yet it was the only thing that had brought him back to the light. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping shadow of the authoritative tone he usually wielded. He asked for the video. He demanded to see the security footage from the station. He needed to confirm the impossible. Maya, his wife, stood by his side, her face a mask of concern and confusion. She didn't understand why he was obsessed with a vagrant, but she complied. The footage was grainy, a jittery black and white ghost of the event. On the screen, the board of directors watched in stunned silence as the tattered figure dropped his violin and moved with the grace of a panther. They watched as he barked orders at the transit police. They watched as he performed a textbook resuscitation in the middle of a subway station. But it was the moment when the man looked directly toward the camera. Just for a second, that the room went cold. The gray eyes, the set of the jaw, the surgical precision of the movement. There was no longer any doubt. The man who had saved the king of the hospital was the man the king had tried to bury alive. The scandal that followed was a slow-motion car crash that Julian could no longer avoid. The story of the miracle surgeon of 42nd Street began to leak into the city's consciousness. It wasn't just a story of a rescue. It was a story of a resurrection. Reporters began to swarm the subway tunnels, looking for the man with the scarred violin. But Marcus had retreated deeper into the shadows of the city. He wasn't looking for a reward. He wasn't looking for a camera. He was waiting for something else, a reckoning that could only happen in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. A week later, Julian Vance did something he had never done in his entire professional life. He checked himself out of his own hospital against medical advice and went to the subway. He didn't take his bodyguards. He didn't take his assistants. He walked down the stairs of the 42nd Street station, his expensive shoes clicking on the grime, his heart fluttering with a mix of fear and an alien sensation called humility. He found Marcus in the same spot, standing against the soot-stained pillar. The violin was in its case. Marcus was simply watching the trains, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn coat. The silence between them was heavier than the rumble of the trains overhead. Julian stopped a few feet away, his breath hitching in his chest. He looked at Marcus really, looked at him and saw the physical toll of the years he had stolen. The thinned hair, the weathered skin, the quiet, dignified exhaustion of a man who had lost everything but his soul. "Why?" Julian finally whispered, the word barely audible over the screech of a departing train. "You could have let me die. No one would have known. It would have been the perfect revenge." "Why did you save me?" Marcus didn't turn his head immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the darkness of the tunnel. "Because I am a doctor, Julian," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated with a terrifying calm. "And unlike you, I never forgot what that means. A doctor doesn't see a rival, or a villain, or a thief. A doctor sees a pulse. A doctor sees a life that is trying to stay. If I had let you die, I would have become the man you tried to convince the world I was. I saved you to save myself." Julian stood paralyzed by the simplicity of the truth. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope of legal confession, signed and notarized, detailing the fabrication of the malpractice evidence. It was the key to Marcus's old life. It was a ticket back to the operating theaters, the millions of dollars, and the prestige. He held it out with a trembling hand. "The board has already been notified. Your license will be reinstated by Monday. The hospital is yours if you want it. I'm resigning." Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at the white paper that represented the restoration of his perfect life. Then, he looked at his scarred violin resting in its case. For 5 years, he had lived in the gilded scraps of society. He had seen the world from the bottom up. He had seen the beauty in the darkness and the profound strength of those who have nothing left to lose. He reached out and took the envelope, but he didn't open it. "I'll take the exoneration," Marcus said softly. "My name belongs to me, but I won't be coming back to your hospital, Julian." That Marcus Hale died in these tunnels, the man standing here now. He has other work to do. In the months that followed, the city of New York witnessed a strange and beautiful transformation. Marcus Hale didn't return to the high-rise offices or the elite surgical suites of the Upper East Side. Instead, he used the settlement money from his wrongful termination to open a small state-of-the-art clinic in the heart of the city, a place where the invisible people of the subway and the streets could receive the world's best care for free. He became known as the guardian of the underground. He still played his violin in the tunnels on Tuesday evenings. The music now a symbol of hope rather than a lament of loss. Julian Vance disappeared from public life, spending his remaining years and his fortune in a quiet, desperate attempt at penance, funding the very clinic that Marcus ran. He had been given a second chance at life, but he would spend it in the shadow of the man he couldn't destroy. The story of Marcus Hale reminds us that the world may take your title, your wealth, and your comfort, but it can never take your character unless you surrender it. Forgiveness is not a gift we give to the person who hurt us. It is the ultimate act of power that frees us from their grip. It is the strength to look at your enemy and choose to be a healer instead of a judge. In the end, we are not defined by the height of our success, but by the depth of our mercy, and the way we play our song when the world has stopped listening. As the sun sets over the Manhattan skyline, casting long amber shadows across the Hudson, the music begins again in the tunnels. It is a melody of resilience, a harmony of the broken and the mended. Marcus Hale draws his bow across the strings, his hands steady and sure. He is no longer the architect of the heart. He is the heart itself. And as the people pass by, they no longer look away. They stop. They listen. They remember that even in the darkest scrap of life, there is something gilded, something holy, and something that if we are brave enough can never be broken.